One. The shooting the shooting was a familiar tragedy in Black Mecca, the name some people had bestowed on the city of Atlanta, home of the defunct civil rights movement. Such an incident hardly merited more than an obligatory mention of the local school newspaper. More light. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, now much better. After all, it was just another killing in the Black Ghetto, euphemistically known as the inner city. Suddenly, however, the death of Daryl Woods became significant, far more significant than his short life ever been. The newspaper began to serialize the story of front page installments. It was now the senseless killing of a man, Maria Elena Fernandez, the young journalist who would make her name with the story, knew instinctively that in 1997, a black family man was singularly newsworthy. In contrast to the statistically stereotypical young black male, Woods was nearly a hero in his seeming ordinariness, the kind of man who was a rare source of black pride. The heinousness of the crime became heavier than homicide. It seemed to snuff out hope in a dark field of black despair. It was not merely that it occurred just as the city, the whole country, was celebrating the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was not even its ultimately just depicts position with the heady aftermath of Atlanta's success as host of the Centennial Olympic Games. It was that this crime had resulted in an irreplaceable loss, the loss of a responsible black man, a black father, and a husband who worked for a living. His widow reminded us the only thing Daryl wanted was to raise a family and have a home. He didn't ask for handouts. We were raising our sons to be men. We didn't want to raise no thugs. Adding insult to injury, his hardworking black father had been killed, shot 3 times, in front of his young sons. Still, the death of Woods did not rise to the point of public outrage, not until the rest 7 days later. The horror of it seemed clear then. The 13-year-old boy was arrested. He was surely black. Blacks whispered to each other on the telepathic grapevine. Woods had been shot in a rough neighborhood, the inner city of Vine City. There was really no question then that the suspect was a black boy. Thereafter, the crime exploded into a sensational spectacle. Fernandez and her colleagues now exposed this reprobate in daily headlines. The early press coverage revealed that the boy known as Little B, as suspected, a troublemaker. He's a thug. Atlanta Police Major Mickey Lloyd could be quoted over and over as saying in the first articles about Little B, which began to appear 2 days after his arrest. When police arrived to take the boy into custody, Lloyd explained he was acting, excuse me, like the thug that he is, and that was the fact that, as the victim's mother said, this thug had slaughtered a man down like a dog in front of his kids. Black Atlanta shook its head in shame. A shudder I was sure I felt in my own apartment. Racists rested their case. This was exactly the kind of scenario that had spawned the new tough on crime laws. Here was a working man, the reports continued, a machine operator who had simply stopped at a corner store with his wife and 2 small boys to buy a soft drink to accompany the family's takeout dinner. Waiting in the family car with his kids while his wife purchased a soda, Woods had been shot and killed in front of his children. The city's mayor, Bill Campbell, who had offered a $2,000 reward to persuade a witness to formally identify the teenager, seemed overcome and announced, "There is no joy in Atlanta today. The tragedy of 2 young boys witnessing their father's murder is compounded by the fact that another boy apparently killed him. My son is 13. It's hard for us to imagine that a 13-year-old would have the will to kill another human being in cold blood. as the facts of this case suggest. But before police provided an explanation for the shooting, the other details were published and punctuated the monstrousness of this crime. The victim's widow had been several weeks pregnant and had suffered a miscarriage the day after little B's arrest. At the funeral, the victim's mother had been obliged to set aside her own grief to console her 2 year old grandson as he reached into the coffin to touch his father's lifeless body. The next major headline quoted Little B's brother, Jason Morgan, as saying of him, he's bad. Morgan was himself being held in jail as a suspect accessory to the murder. Others agreed with Morgan's characterization. Eric Mills, a 21-year-old friend of Morgan's who had been arrested as the original suspect in the murder and was now being held as an accessory, reportedly told police that he had witnessed the shooting. He had tried, he said, but he had been unable to stop Little B, even though he pleaded with him. Little B, don't do that, Morgan validated his friend's account. I don't know if he did this, but Eric says he told my brother not to do it. So he must have done it. Furthermore, juvenile court records, which Miss Fernandez had been able to obtain in spite of laws prohibiting their publication, suggested that Little B was a repeat offender. He had been brought before a judge 12 times since he was 10, she told readers. Finally, police leaked their theory about the shooting. Little B had done it to gain respect, they speculated, and to prove his quote unquote manhood. The Atlanta Journal Constitution daily bombarded the city with headlines referring to these unconfirmed reports that this boy, this thug, quote unquote, had ritualistically killed to prove his quote unquote manhood. Little B, the Little B accusation was beginning to take on a familiar tone, echoing an age old refrain about the savagery of black boys, recalling the dark histories of Emmett Till and the Scottsboro Boys. What was most startling about this steady demonization of Little B, though, was the silence of blacks themselves, especially the local black leadership. Not a single voice was lifted from the pulpit or the podium to challenge the premise or the implications of the wild assertions being made about this black boy, not to mention the pretrial presumption of his guilt contained here therein. The silence suggests that blacks who had slipped into the mainstream of society were drinking from the tributary of racism that still flowed there. Hmm, that's deep. Hmm. The silence suggested that blacks who had slipped into the mainstream of society were drinking from the tributary of racism that still flowed there. These same blacks had um, voraciously demanded fair treatment in the O.J. Simpson case and had stood by Simpson and understood and rejected the racist stereotype of him, the image of the black man as a beast. But in the case of Little B, there was no demand that judgment be reserved pending the outcome of the trial. No cry to halt the vilification campaign, at least until there had been a full investigation of the facts. There was only this hush of seeming shame and obsequious squish sense to all. Sorry, guys, it's been a while since I've actually read. I'll give it a try. And to all the public speculation about the savage nature of Little B, who had surely committed this senseless killing. The image of him thus came to be interpreted or imprinted on the mass mind. In the first days of February, the Journal Constitution ran a front page feature that opened with the lines barely a teenager, the 13-year-old known around the Vine City neighborhood as Little B, wanted to be thought of as a man, a tough man. The feature's author Fernandez noted that in comparison, Daryl Woods, 23, father of two, and a loving husband, had a different vision of maturity. He worked hard, dreaming of owning a home and wanted to provide for his family. While quoting both police sources and members of the victim's family, Fernandez's article did not include a statement by anyone who might have had a different version of the boy who was still only a suspect in the crime. Now came the first of the opinion pieces about the collateral atrocities of Little B's crimes, following up on the collective article herein, wherein the Atlanta Constitution's editorial board had noted that society must protect itself from such children, even if it means locking them up for most of their lives. A black editor named Jeff Dickerson accused Little B of contributing to the destruction of the black family in an essay entitled "Another Black Father Dies." Dickerson forcefully assailed the 13-year-old thug known as Little B, who was charged with killing a black father, and argued that this murder was a cautionary tale about catastrophic consequences attendant on the sweeping breakdown of the black family over the previous decade or so. The trend affected not only all of Atlanta, but the entire nation. 13-year-olds without fathers, quote unquote, are out there gunning down real fathers, which the black community boasts so few of. Next came the features, come editorials dramatizing the demonic nature of the boy. Reporter Dave Kindred remarked on the maliciousness of the crime. Police said the boy shot an unarmed man 3 times, and not only had the shooter killed an unarmed man, but he had also shot the man with his 2 small children in the car. Moreover, the shooter, whoever it was, did more than kill a man. The man's pregnant wife had a miscarriage as a result, so the shooter killed a man and a baby. Kindred went on to examine the degenerate history of the suspected shooter Lil B. Friends say the boy's mother lost him due to the streets and didn't care much. He didn't go to school. Police called him a thug. His brother said he's bad. He quoted the Suz and the Korean immigrants who owned the store in front of the Woods' murder had occurred, who recounted their efforts to help Little B. I told him, Mr. Suh said, if you're hungry and have no credit, I'll give you credit. Don't steal. But his wife, Myung Suh, said Little B was too wild, quote unquote. Finally, Atlanta saw him. Little B in connection with his first court appearance. The newspaper printed a photograph of the back of his head on the front page. The hearing was on the issue of whether or not Little B could or would be tried as an adult. The new law gave prosecutors absolute discretion in certain categories of crimes to try children as adults from the age of 13. The photographic glimpse of Little B showed that his head was small and his shoulders narrow. He appeared to be just a whisper of a boy, barely prepubescent. His faceless photograph seemed to illustrate the irrelevancy of his life, except as he had come to be held forth as an emblem of social decay and black shame. Only days had passed since his arrest, but clearly he had already been judged guilty. His lawyer was a young black woman named Patrice Grant, who appeared alongside Little B in the photograph. Her expression was compassionate, and her touch on his shoulder looked ever so gentle. The caption identified the boy as a 13-year-old who reportedly killed a man for quote unquote disrespecting him. The headline announced the outcome of the hearing. Little B faces judge, sobbing tough teen to be tried as an adult in killing. In the coming days, more came to be disclosed about the background of this boy who had become the focus of public disdain and outrage. The boy whom Kindred had summarily indicted as an evil in our town, according to Atlanta school officials, Little B had not enrolled for 2 years. At the same time, Fernandez reiterated he had appeared 12 times in Fulton County Juvenile Court, commencing with an assault charge when he was 10 years old. Then the issue of manhood as a motivation was scrutinized based on Atlanta Police Detective S.E. Waters' testimony at the last hearing. Little B became angry when he when he twice asked Woods to turn off his headlights and Woods refused. By not dimming his lights, the man in the car disrespected Little B. Further, Waters testified Little B told his mother that he shot the man. The case seemed closed. It was February 6th, less than 2 weeks after the arrest. The trial would begin in November. Despite the fact that there seemed to be nothing left to report on the matter, stories about Little B continued. Little B continued to fill the pages of the Atlanta Journal Constitution, thence to be carried over into the unabated public outrage. There was the piece that held up the boys' 2 year absence from school as a means to examine the widespread problem of the inner city truancy and its ramifications. There was the commentary concerning Little B's seeming sociopathic nature, his quote unquote thuggery, as validated not only by the police, the Korean grocer, and even his own brother, but also by a host of neighbors who desired anonymity. Somewhere I can say that word. I've always had a problem saying that word, anonymity, on account of obscure fears. The most striking article in this sequence was the one that bore the headline, A Teen's Choice, Accused Killer Wanted, Life on the Street. This was effectively a profile of a woman who identified herself as Little B's guardian. Marilyn Reed explained that because she had known Little B's mother, Valerie Johnson, for years and knew how hard Johnson was trying to overcome her drug problem, she had taken in Little B herself at least until October of 1995. After acting as the boy's guardian for a year, however, and doing the best she could um, during that period, she had concluded that Little B could not be helped. He wanted to be a thug, quote unquote. It was Mrs. Reed's contention that Little B had choices, opportunities he had rejected. He had, for example, refused to stay in school. And in the end, he had run away from his guardian's home and from the stable life she had provided for him. There was no mention of Little B's guardianship after October of 1995. Later, it would be disclosed that during the last 2 years before his arrest, when he was absent from school and not living with Mrs. Reed, Michael Lewis, quote unquote, Little B, had been under guardianship of the state in the form of the Department of Family and Children's Services, DFACS. When Michael was 11 years old, DCFAS had sought and obtained a court order declaring Valerie Johnson as an unfit mother. There was no father on the scene. No information was forthcoming as to what DCFS had done as his guardian. And after that, after that court order was issued, it was, as it turned out, Michael had lived in pretty much on the street. Michael had lived pretty much on the street from the time he was 11 until he was arrested at 13 in January of 1997. As the months passed and the newspaper articles about Little B began to form a mountain, I came to realize the rage in them as it echoed in the street was about something bigger than this murder case. It became evident, for example, in an editorial advocating the toughening of juvenile crime laws by lowering to 10 the age at which a child could be sentenced to quote unquote boot camp. A change posed by a black state senator, David Scott, and endorsed by Atlanta Police Chief Beverly Harvard. Scott's proposal had become even more compelling. The editorial argued in light of this latest case, since murder suspect Little B had been before juvenile authorities 12 times in 2 years, but had never been sentenced. Targeting Little B and others like him, the new bill would at last get them off the street. Something had to be done, the editorial insisted. It's a sad testament that today in the city of Atlanta, people are under siege from kids. Then there was the subsequent Journal Constitution editorial, in which young black journalist Frederick D. Robinson grieved over his own fear of young black street toughs, and exacerbated rampant black on black crime. Even if every white racist turned from their ways, the little bees of the world wouldn't disappear, Robinson wrote. At this point, and this was the point finally, the outrage about little bees, about the death of Daryl Woods, it was about the very existence of the little bees of the world. These fictional, no, these non-fictional bigger Thomases and guilty Emmett Tills. Now some blacks were even calling for the rope. Littleby had to become symbolically responsible for the complete deterioration of the Vine City in which he had grown up, whose streets he had wandered around for those last couple of years. This became clear in another Journal Constitution article, which held up the case of Little B as an example of just how far Vine City had fallen. The decline arrests attested to the reminiscences of a 75-year-old resident. This used to be a beautiful community with shops, dressers, a beauty parlor, and my own rage by then was pounding. This child, this black boy, had become a scapegoat for the poverty and despair still suffered by Atlanta's black masses. He was being castigated in the same way that the biblical goat of Aaron had been cast out into the wilderness with all the sin of the children of Israel heaped on his head. I was aware, of course, that across the nation, black children like Michael Lewis were being singled out by angry whites as a certain segment of the black population as proof that something was wrong with Black America. Mm. Now it seemed, though Little B's irredeemable transgressions, we knew what that something quote unquote was. As Black Journal Constitution editorial writer Frederick Robinson had opened, the problem was no longer a matter of lack of opportunity. Rather, he suggested some other element, and apparently sinister one, had seeped into the soul of the inner city culture, bringing with it a loss of self respect, self love, and personal responsibility. As I witnessed the wrath rising in the city over this boy, ceaselessly spilling from the headlines and the television reports into the streets, my reaction turned from rage to sorrow. I was not so much angry now over how swiftly this boy had been damned. I was more anguished by thoughts of what 13-year-old Michael Lewis must be feeling, suspended as he was over an abyss of absolute abandonment in the universe he occupied. I could remember feeling something like that myself as a child. I could remember trembling in fearful and loneliness, feeling unwanted in the world in which I had been born, black and female and poor, circumscribed to a Philadelphia ghetto and predestined to isolation from the mainstream of society, whites only preserve. Now there was silence from the Black quarter over the injustice of the public trial and condemnation of Little B. Nobody who had a voice, neither the blacks or nor the white liberals, seemed to even honor the legal notion that Michael Lewis should be presumed innocent, with the exception of early early appearance by his mother at the time of the hearing, where it was determined that Michael would be tried as a man. No family members came to see about him, and even she, as caught by the photographer's lens, seemed insensate. Her gaze empty of everything, a diet of crack cocaine having left her gaunt, with sunken cheeks and perhaps a frozen heart. Yikes. Um, but she was all he had. Nobody else claimed him. Nobody had a dream for a boy like him anymore. This knowledge filled me with sorrow. Then I remembered the touch of the young black attorney in that first photograph, the gentle protection of her hand on his shoulder. I set out to find Patrice Grant. She had a broad and genuine smile and a commitment to her smile. Hmm. and commitment to her to she had a broad spot and a commitment to her client. I meant little B. Her commitment seemed bigger than her smile, more vital than her youth, more beautiful than her brown face, framed by cascades of braids. She was a graduate of prestigious Emory University of Law. Unlike most of the few blacks who were her professional peers, Patrice had not chosen to grab for the golden ring of the corporate world. She had determined to bide, as I saw it. That is, Patrice Grant was holding onto a forgotten dream, a flame of justice, no matter how horrible, how feeble it had become, no matter how alone she might be in doing. When I saw when I finally saw her standing there in the meager offices of the Fulton County conflict defender, she seemed pathetically idealistic. Indeed, a lawyer and client made a sorry pair. She was his only hope, and he her charge, to whose defense she was dedicated. I wanted to join their ragtag army. Patrice hugged me and welcomed me. Then she told me that little B was innocent. I need my reading glasses because I can't really see. Damn, damn, damn. that? Okay. Chapter. Can't find those. I can't find the good reading glasses, but these will do. Chapter 2, the murdered case. I didn't kill that man. I didn't kill nobody, ma'am, Michael Lewis told me when I saw him briefly some months later. I didn't even know what they wanted. I just opened the door and they came on in and told me to put up my hands. I kept asking them what I'd done. My heart was beating fast. None of this was the answer to any questions I had posed or even had in mind, I thought, scrutinizing the tenderness of his age and his manner. An inoculated Georgia, gently attended by an indigenous drawl. There was no hair on his face, which was a Hershey's kiss, small and dark and sweet. The hair on his head was close cropped, neat, framing small ears and nose, complementing smooth lips. His expression, like his gaze, was reserved but for the hint of a smile that revealed stark white teeth. That's true. I was really I was not really interested in the truth about the murder, for I had begun to understand more in regard than I wanted to. There had been a river of unsolicited revelations from Gary Pritchard, and I did not want to know more. Pritchard was the other attorney from the Fulton County Conflict Defender's Office assigned to handle Michael's defense. He was, in fact, the lead attorney on the team, assisted by Patrice Grant. The Office of the Conflict Defender had been created a few years before to guarantee the right of legal counsel to indigenous criminal suspects in cases where a conflict of interest existed between or among defendants represented by the Public Defender's Office. The conflict defended the Conflict Defender's Office also handled the rising number of cases in which juveniles were tried as adults. In 1994, a new piece of legislation proposed by the then Governor Mark Zellmiller, by then Governor Zellmiller, and sponsored by Representatives Mark Taylor, soon to be the state's lieutenant governor, and Robert Brown, a black legislator from Macon, authorized the state to try children as young as 13 as adults for certain categories of crimes, collectively referred to as the seven deadly sins. The legislation, still commonly known as SB 440, became effective in early 1995. Gitchard had just suggested to me, almost immediately after we met, that he knew who had really killed Daryl Woods. He said that Michael knew and had told him, and wanted Michael to tell the truth about what he knew. But Michael was afraid. Gitchard added. Gary was a thirstyish caramel colored black who wore suits that fit him like sausage skins. Oh my gosh, funny. Um, okay, where was I? Um, oh, that was funny. I can't get that picture on my head. I'm not going to mess me up. He did not seem to possess the street savvy necessary for a criminal defense attorney. Although he had never met me before, he willingly talked to me about his theory of murder and his plans for Michael's defense, which was to point a finger at someone else as the killer. Um, he would help Michael set aside his fears, he said, and accept that the strategy would mean victory. Gichard also told me that during the first meeting that he attended to surprise the prosecutor and the whole courtroom with Michael's testimony at trial. He would do it, he elaborated, in the same sensational way that Perry Mason had always shocked television audiences by exposing the real killers in his cases, often forcing confessions in open court. Parenthetically, Gichard told me that he was, in fact, the Perry Mason television series that it was that had inspired him to pursue a career as a criminal defense attorney. The next time I met Gichard, he was trying to find Valerie. Valerie Johnson, also known as Valerie Morgan, was a crack addict and prostitute whose innumerable brushes with the law had resulted in as many arrests. Although incidentally she was Michael's mother, she had 2 years before lost custody of Michael in the court hearing in which she had been deemed an unfit mother. What the heck? I've been waiting. I'm on live right now, and I'm just like, okay, where was I? Let's see. Harry, or in the, oh yes, thirstiest caramel colored man. More about this. Oh, Valerie. Okay, yes, looking for Valerie's mother, and then had lost legal custody of Michael in the court hearing in which she had deemed an unfit mother. Long before that, she had lost touch with her own humanity, having made the proverbial Faustian deal with a drug dealer. A deal with the police was an afterthought, even if that afterthought condemned her 13-year-old son. She had reportedly just signed a statement saying that Michael had, quote unquote, confessed to her. Gichard wanted to talk with her about it. Gichard, Patrice Grant, and I all met for lunch at Sylvia's, an upscale soul food franchise. Oh, I don't know Sylvia. That's pretty nice. That sat at a busy intersection amid Atlanta's downtown government office buildings. Marvin Dixon, the investigator for the case, joined us. In stark contrast to Gichard, Dixon was streetwise. He had grown up in Atlanta and knew the streets and the people of the bluff. As that part of the Vine City district in which the murder had occurred was known, Dixon even had the police contacts in the area. He was, moreover, familiar with the particular corner of the bluff where Woods had been killed a few months before, a corner known as New Jack City. Life in the bluff was simple and raw. Dixon testified over a plate of barbecued chicken swimming in sauce, piled high with collard greens. Everything, every activity was there related. I'm just really tired. I don't know what I'm doing. Why am I? Yeah. Uh, Dixon suggested that addicts, users, and dealers throughout Atlanta regarding New Jack City as a sort of one-stop drive-through drug supermarket. This fact alone had aroused numerous suspicions about Woods' killing in Dixon's investigative mind. Let me show you what I mean, he said after lunch, speaking on in soft, close-lipped way of a man who could draw information from the darkest crevices of the city, a street corner confidant. Dixon slid his wiry body smoothly into the driver's seat of his Mercedes, laughing with a crooked smile at my comments that he looked like as if he could be Little Beast's father. Michael's real father was typically an unknown phantom. Dixon's suit was gray, like his car, and sharp. In the vernacular of my day, as were his polished shoes and white shirt. Richard sat up front with him, while Patrice and I spoke together in the rear. Muslim style, we joked with each other. Swishing away from Sylvia's, we drove west in the expansive of traffic lanes of Techwood Boulevard, soon passing the massive CNN Center. Within seconds, we were assaulted by the giant red roof of the Georgia Sports Dome, which dominates the horizon, reigning over networks of boulevards and freeways, arteries that converge there, at once segregation and integration of the city. Passing this sprawl, we seemed in danger of being swallowed up by the dome's gargantuan parking entrance, a gaping mouth waiting to be fed of the mostly white and spruce white fed let me start slow down fed the cars of the mostly white sports enthusiasts who would arrive there from suburban Atlanta for a Falcons game, borne on the safety of concrete shoulders. From there, we followed a serpentine route to our intended destination. Dixon navigated with ease, carrying us through the maze of the streets into the core of the bluff. None of us, none of the rest of us, all Atlanta transplants, would have been able to find it on our own. As a native of the asphalt ghetto streets of Philadelphia, I had to resist making a spontaneous association as we entered the area between the savage growth of grass and trees all around and a middle class community. Soon enough, the illusion created by the greenery disappeared, leaving the stark reality of raw sewage. The bluff housed the bottom of life in Atlanta. Dixon transported us through its bowels, a suggestion journey of streams of charred dwellings and vacant lots, past shuffling bodies expressing despair in April sunlight. Life was conspicuously irrelevant and cheap in the bluff, a dark parallel universe to the Atlanta that beamed only blocks beyond in a shimmering skyline of corporate growth. The bluff's only link to that Atlanta was the dope dealers operating there, whose prof, preferred them passage out. There were two or three walking each block, recognizable by anyone with eyes, all glaring back at us, outfitted rather uniformly in Nike sports ensembles, accessories with diamond earrings and solid gold necklaces, watches, rings, and dental crowns. The bastard African chieftains on another day, linking time and space by means of pastel-colored personal pages and the latest in cellular phones. Eric Knowles, known as Big E, and named in news reports as a key witness in the Woods murder case, had been one of the population dope dealers. Dixon explained to me over his Dixon explained to me over his shoulder as we wound through the bluff's blocks of cut off streets to the corner of Griffin Street and Meldrum Street that was called New Jack City. We were the police, or so-called, or social workers, or customers, question mark. So many empty, staring eyes seemed to wander. I myself began to wonder aloud why anyone would stop at the grandiosity named Henry's Supermarket there to buy a soda. There was a chorus of laughter inside the Mercedes. Why, I went on, had Daryl Woods chosen this store on this corner, particularly after dark? Could his death have been a murder rather than an arbitrary street killing? If such a distinction could be made in light of the finality of the result? This last question was chillingly punctuated with when Dixon broke in with the rather surprising, quote unquote, to me, in parentheses, information that it had been Kenya Woods, Daryl's 23-year-old wife, who had driven the car to Henry's that fateful night. The newspaper accounts had left the impression that the young Mrs. Woods, being pregnant, had craved a soda, as pregnant women are wont do, and that Woods had accommodated his wife's craving by stopping at the first place he could find. But no mere cravings, I thought. Remembering my own pregnancy seemed capable of compelling a stop at New Jack City, unless it was for marijuana or cocaine or heroin, which were all, of course, also there, and certainly in greater abundance than Atlanta's own Coca Cola. Although there was nothing to suggest that Kenya Woods had any inclination, I was not alone in my newly inspired suspicions about the notion of buying a soda at Henry's, which had seemed to me to constitute an original idea when I voiced them. Dixon told us that his investigation had uncovered the fact that the widow Woods had reported her husband to the police on numerous occasions for battery, and specifically battery of her. This was a stark conflict with the image that had been projected citywide by the press. The portrait Mrs. Woods herself had painted of a loving marriage tragically cut short by a senseless, vicious act. In fact, Woods's beatings of his wife were one of the reasons they had, only months before, left their apartment in College Park, an area a good distance away and easily a grade or so better, to move to the bluff. Even though Kenya had told reporters, as she would testify in court, that she and Daryl had left their College Park apartment to save money towards variously buying a new house or enabling her to continue her education. They had actually been evicted. And they had been evicted not only because of non payment of rent, but also because the landlord had received too many complaints from neighbors about disturbances caused by the husband's beatings of his wife. Dixon had a copy of the evidence notice along with the neighbors' written accounts of the incidents. As Dixon deftly wheeled his car past Henry's, following Quitard's latest thought on where quote unquote Val might be, he offered his observations freely. That that was where Kenya and Daryl had lived, he pointed out, in a nondescript gray wooded paneled duplex on a little street that bore a big name of Western Avenue. I noted that it was impossible to drive onto Griffin Street from Western Avenue, which ran only a few blocks east and west, and dead-ended street and Vine Street, some blocks east of Griffin. A waist-high chain link fence secured by a lock cut off the small driveway to the right of the duplex where the family had lived. One of the neighbors, an old man, had told Dixon that the Woodses had a Toyota Land Cruiser parked behind the fence until some men came and removed it the night before the killing. The women were out by the time we returned to New Jack City, and children's faces could be seen peering out from behind the porch doors and barred windows of the helter-skelter landscape. Some of the women had situated themselves in folding chairs across from Henry's. We rolled by, still searching for Val. They sat there. They sat in their chairs, possessed by the potion called crack that had rendered them apparitions of their former selves, waiting for the vampire's fix. Nighttime would be the right time when food stamps and any other thing of any value could be traded for cash, which could in turn be traded for crack. Exchanges that occurred just outside Henry's door. Some of the women shuffled back and forth across a small street that intersected there, creating, along with a born again madman preaching on one corner, an incredibly cacophony. The one with the iridescent pink fluffy slippers sitting in her chair in a prominent place on the corner opposite Henry's, emaciated like all the other women, would be a witness against Michael, Patrice Grant told me. Like all the rest, this woman was waiting for her pusher man. The main man who ran this spot was unavailable, though others yet worked the surrounding alleyways that passed for streets. She seemed still to be this man's eyes and ears, but Big E had not been servicing the corner since January. He and two of his lieutenants were in jail, as was another associate, Michael's half brother, Jason Morgan, known as J Boy. Another gaunt and ghostly figure of a woman suddenly appeared as we were about to circle the area again. She was a friend of Valerie Johnson's. Dixon stopped the car at Guichard's command. Guichard beckoned to her. She shuffled over to the car and leaned down to talk to him through the open passenger window. She was a nervous squirrel, glancing back and forth while speaking with the attorney. Her eyes were shaded by the bill of the baseball cap she wore, which somehow complemented the man's pants and golf shirt that hung from her body. Her dark skin was now ashen. Val was around the corner. She swore in a raspy whisper, presenting a toothless grin. Yes, yes, she would tell her that Richard wanted to see her. She would be right back. On hold. Richard's apparent expectation that Valerie Johnson would soon appear amazed me. All of us were certainly suspect to the inhibitions there. If not as police or social workers, then surely as something official, something that stood outside of and thus threatened their desperate way of life. Nobody would be volunteering to talk to such outsiders. Valerie Johnson, of course, did not appear, though her friend actually did return after about 15 minutes to report that Val had just left the place where she thought she was, and she had in fact only been there moments before, the friend had swore. Nobody knew where she had gone. As Dixon drove off, Guichard hollered back to the expressionless friend to tell Val to call him. This would not happen, not that day, not ever. Valerie Johnson had already signed her statement for the district attorney, maintaining that her son Michael had quote unquote confessed to her that he had killed Daryl Woods. Through the prosecutor, though the prosecutor would be unable to introduce this questionable statement as evidence at trial, she would never disavow it. Despite her shadow existence, Valerie Johnson was clinging to life as enabled by a man who could imprison her, the district attorney, and a man and who she had been long dependent on, Big E. What the heck? I knew that. Okay. Something was wrong, it seemed to me, with the story of Darnell Woods' murder. A few days after our visit to the Bluff, I went to Captain D's fast food takeout in the West End on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard, which used to be Gordon Street before the death of the famous civil rights leader. I think their street names are really kind of long in Georgia. Um, let's see. Despite some trepidation, I had decided to drive the same route Kenya Woods had presumably driven on the night her husband was killed. She had reported that with her children in tow, she had picked up Woods at a place of employment as a machine operator at around 6:30 that evening, and that from there the family had gone to Captain D's to buy dinner. En route from home, En route home from the restaurant, she had gotten thirsty and had stopped at Henry's at around 7:20 to buy a soda. While driving, I made notes. Going east on Abernathy toward Ashby Street, right after Captain D's, and on the same side street, I spotted a Wendy's franchise. I had gone a few blocks west instead. I would have encouraged the giant. I would have encountered the giant Kroger supermarket, referred to by some in the black community as the BB, pronounced Bebe Kroger, on account of the seeming predominance of older black ladies who shop there. Traveling east, though, within 2 blocks, I arrived at Ashby Street, where I turned left to go north. Another block further east on Abernathy Street was Lee Street, where there was a much frequented Krispy Kreme donut shop, and across from that, the rambling West End Mall. Contagious to the mall were a Taco Bell drive-through, a BP gas station. Oh, contiguous to the mall was a contagious. Contiguous to the mall were a Taco Bell drive-through, a BP gas station, and a Church's Chicken outlet. Same Church's Chicken. Okay, all of these places sold soda. Yeah. Driving north on Ashby toward Western Avenue, where the Woodses had lived, I passed a strip mall on my left in the first block, and then another. A block later, just before the I-20 freeway entrance, passing under the freeway overpass, I noted an Exxon gas station and a mini market, and then at Westview, the Mrs. Winter's Chicken and Biscuits and Domino's Pizza locations patronized by students from the neighborhood. Morehouse, Clark Atlanta, and Spelman colleges. Soon I saw a supermarket across from another Church's Chicken at the busy intersection with Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. There was there were a McDonald's, a Kentucky Fried Chicken, a BP gas station, a Quick Shop Mart, an Amico gas station, and the Ashby Street Rib Shack, all of which would surely have been open around 7 on a January evening, and all of which sold a variety of sodas in relatively secure settings. Rather than continue to north, Rather than continue north to Bankhead Avenue, an extension of Bankhead Highway, which had given its name to the popular Bankhead Bounce, the dance that black kids all over the nation were doing, I took the next logical step and turned right. Going east on Simpson Street, Western Avenue was 2 short blocks north of Simpson. The corner of Ashby and Simpson still maintained a pulse, a final reminder that it had once been full of life. Now it barely was hanging on, its slow demise being at once its chief activity, like a cancer victim busy with chemotherapy. The dominant chemical here, of course, was crack cocaine. My friend Marva would later tell me that Monique's variety store, the deteriorating market that dominated the Four Corners, used to be a really popular place back in the day before the crack era. In any case, Monique still sold sodas, as did the small store across from it on Ashby and the little market a few blocks away on Simpson. At the intersection with James P. Brawley, more significantly, I concluded as I drove along Simpson, eyeing the children playing dangerously close to the street in front of the raised wooden duplexes that filled the huge gaps left by left by any number of condemned and abandoned properties. It was impossible to be blind to the possibilities of purchasing a soft drink on this bustling boulevard and at the same time possess the vision to spot the lights of Henry's on Griffin Street, around 7 blocks north of Simpson. Yet Kenya Woods had stated and would maintain that being new to the neighborhood, she had simply stumbled upon Henry's that evening, attracted by the market's lights. Incredibly, at the corner of Simpson and Griffith Street itself, she would have had to pass up the Simpsons Plaza small liquor store in to turn left onto Griffin and then maneuver the car along the 7 blocks of this narrow, dark passageway to buy her a soda at Henry's. A purchase that would cost her husband his life. It took me several more trips to turn that corner, that is, to find the courage to make that left turn onto Griffin Street. It seemed evident to me that there could be no reason to leave the relative safety of nobody ever texts me. Oh, my cousin. Mm, Yeah, how would I put on D&D? New to this. All right. So, all right, back at it. Okay, we're turning the corner. It seemed evident to me that there could be no, yes, that there could be no good reason to leave the relative safety of Simpson Street and make that turn unless one lived or had businesses there or had business there. Um, otherwise, oh yes, unless one lived or had business there. Otherwise, that turn was a dangerous proposition for only the real business operating there and operating at the most brutal level was the drug trade. I knew the danger of Griffin Street instinctively. The same danger had existed in East Oakland when I was living there, had wound through the ghetto, the pre crack ghetto of North Philly during my youth, and persisted in every urban ghetto across the nation at the end of the 20th century. I knew the danger of interfering with the business of what Huey Newton called the illegitimate black capitalists, the ghetto entrepreneurs who denied bank loans and other business opportunities on account of their race, carved out what was left of America's economic pie for themselves in the crude fashion of the robber barons and mafiosos of another day. So it was with Griffin Street's drug entrepreneurs. Legitimacy might come bearing a calm activity, a calm civility, but it was only for those ruthless enough to manipulate or to rule the marketplace. All of this had to be clear to anybody who turned onto those blocks of Griffin Street, whether from Bankhead or Simpson, and no less clear to the innumerable black and white college students who bought retail drugs there than it was to the small time dope distributors who bought wholesale, or to the natives and the neighboring addicts. Everyone who made that turn had to appreciate what was happening on that stretch of pavement. So the question in my mind was what really could have motivated Kenya Woods to drive her red Mitsubishi down Griffin Street the night of her husband was gunned down in front of her children. Then, too, I wondered this if these blocks were known as heavy drug trafficking area. If this area, these blocks were known as a heavy drug trafficking area, as the prosecutor in the case would repeat over and over during Michael Lewis's trial, and if they formed one of the most lawless districts in the city in terms of not only drug trafficking but also prostitution, why had the officers of Atlanta Police Department Zone 1 done nothing, Zone 1 done nothing, done next to nothing about the problem? No one had to speculate long about the ambition of Paul Howard, the recently elected district attorney of Fulton County. Howard was a member of that elite legion of anonymous blacks who were direct beneficiaries of the civil rights movement. He had graduated from the Emory University School of Law in 1976. Oh, that was before I was born. Um, a time when more blacks than ever were being admitted into colleges and professional schools across America. Little victories of the hard battles fought by blacks to institute programs of affirmative action. It was, too, a time when Atlanta had just elected its first black mayor. Howard's career as a lawyer was undistinguished thereafter. The curriculum vitae of a legal bureaucrat, including a stint as a deputy solicitor for the Atlanta Municipal Court and another as an assistant district attorney for Fulton County, the entity that incorporates the bulk of the city of Atlanta. Notwithstanding this history, Howard seemed to possess an extraordinary drive for personal achievement. In this case, at least, he was reminiscent of Clarence Thomas, another black boy from rural Georgia pinpoint to Howard's Waynesboro. Howard's ambition had been evidenced in his quest to become the first Black district attorney ever elected in the state of Georgia. He had vigorously sought and obtained the strong support of established Black politicians, including not only to the current mayor, Bill Campbell, but also Atlanta's influential first Black mayor, Maynard Jackson. After defeating a Black woman, Louise Hornsby, in the Democratic, oops, in the Democratic Party, he had gone on to win against his white Republican opponent. It's crazy. Okay. Hot, hot, hot. Hot, hot, hot. It's getting hot in here. Just trying to get my hours. All right. Oh, here we go. Yes. Okay. Fulton County entity that incorporate the both. Okay. Notwithstanding, yes, this rural Georgia. Okay. After, yes, Howard, who proudly referred to himself as a Morehouse man, a graduate of that historically Black college for men that was also the alma mater of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was sworn into office January 1997 at Morehouse's Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel. There, speaking with a barely detectable lisp produced by his malformed and thickly mustached upper lip, he told his supporters, a gathering of mostly white or mostly middle class blacks, that he would, quote unquote, reestablish a community of justice. Howard had never really articulated a plan for such a reestablishment, his clearest campaign goal having been to become a, quote unquote, first Black. In the scheme of things, the Fulton County District Attorney's Office was the most important in Georgia, Atlanta being the hub of the county, the state, and in fact the region. Howard may not have had a plan, but he had made a promise or two. For the blacks who had supported him, his victory satisfied his promise to represent race on the most basic level. But Howard had also campaigned on a promise to get tough on crime, speaking in the jargon of the day, tougher than his Republican rival, former Bartow County Assistant District Attorney Brett Ladd, and perhaps even than the outgoing Fulton County District Attorney Lewis Slayton, who was retiring. While the blacks of Atlanta who still voted were surely proud of this quote unquote first, no matter what his agenda might be, and hopeful with regard to his promise to reestablish justice, the white majority of Howard's constituency were relying on his other promise. In the latter part of 1996, when Howard was waging his election campaign, Atlanta still claimed the notorious distinction of having both the fourth highest overall crime rate and the highest violent crime rate in the nation. The fact that the city had survived that summer's Centennial Olympic Games with little incident, aside from the infamous Olympic Park bombing, seemed to some a virtual miracle. At the same time, the largest success of the Games had allowed Atlanta to rise again, like the phoenix to its symbol, to the brink of greatness. The crime rate, the crime rate is now stood as the sole hindrance to the city's claim to its Olympian legacy and to what many saw as its divine destiny to be the hub and economic center of the so-called New South. My water, okay. Yeah, I've heard that. That was the New South, sparking a crown jewel that could and would lure more and more businesses and trade tourism to its bosom. Atlanta had to seize the day to cleanse itself, or at least its image, of this taint. At the same time, crime in Atlanta as in the rest of America had a color, or in any event, crime statistics had a color, and that color was black. Although blacks comprised of only about 13% of the total population of the United States, more than half of those convicted of crimes were black. In Georgia, around 70% of the prison population was black. Moreover, the children arrested and tried as adults in Fulton County and neighboring DeKalb County, 94% were black. Therefore, there had been no question then as to the meaning of Paul Howard's promise to quote unquote get tough on crime, or on black crime in the inner city, or on black criminals. Indeed, Howard had, as one commentary in the Atlanta Business Chronicle stated, at the height of his campaign, postured himself more as running for sheriff. Post Olympics, Howard's pledge bore extraordinary weight, much of which now rested on his victorious shoulders. The city's powerful Fortune 500 businessmen were waiting. Meanwhile, however, the black bureaucratic pyramid of the city's government, topped by the mayor and the police chief Beverly Harvard, the first black woman police chief of a major city, was teetering precariously on the question of whether or not it could provide the right environment for post Olympics business interests. Failure at this crucial juncture would cause the pyramid to crumble and fail, and plunge the remains of its black bureaucracy into a fall from grace like that of blacks previously so situated in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, all of whom had been replaced by right leaning whites. Howard's ability to deliver on his promise was the linchpin in their very survival. On the corner, in the context of these two great intersects, black and white, government business, which were in the end joined. Howard's promise made him the man of the hour. Within days of being sworn in as the first new district attorney of any color in Fulton County in 30 years, the length of Slayton's tenure, the case of the shooting death was Daryl Woods. This case of the shooting death of Daryl Woods came across Howard's desk. That it was not particularly outstanding. It was not a particularly outstanding case on its merits, and reflected in the brevity of the initial printed report of the murder in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Perhaps the only distinction between it and other, apparently similar shootings in the most drug infested and poorest ghetto districts of Atlanta, Vine City, and the Bluff was the fact that the victim's small children had witnessed the killing. Perhaps that matter, it was that victim, as a young black man, had even had a wife and children with whom he lived in a nuclear family unit. The commonness of this type of crime was such that Woods's own family had experienced it before, only a year or so earlier. Daryl's cousin, Michael Cortez Woods, had been likewise gunned down and killed. But in the rightist political atmosphere that charged the nation in the post Reagan years, when family values and tough on crime notions were intertwined with cultural sound bites, and in a city that was holding its economic breath, waiting to claim its divine destiny, and in a political milieu that seemed to be the last bastion of black elected officials in the 20th century, this case gave Howard an immediate opportunity to make good on his campaign promise and at the same time make a name for himself. Adding excitement to the pot, the mayor suddenly announced that he was offering a $2,000 reward for information about the killer of this black husband and father, a reward matched by Bishop Eddie Long, the superstar minister of one of Atlanta's New Age black megachurches. New Birth Missionary Baptist, yes, New Birth Missionary Baptist. Soon, 1 week to the day after Woods' murder, Eric Mills, known as Big E, was arrested as the prime suspect. Also arrested in connection with the murder was Jason Morgan, or J-Boy. These arrests were made on the strength of a sudden rush to in the sudden rush of reports provided by a host of informants come addicts, desperate to get their hands on $4,000. Whatever the weaknesses of this information, the case would have made a politically compelling one for Howard. Uh, Big E had already been convicted the previous year for drug possession, a conviction for which he was still on probation. J Boy, too, was on probation for a drug possession and was facing charges for stealing a handgun. In an incident dating from November 1996, Big E was also looking at two new felony charges for possession of drugs with intent to sell. Under the state's penal code, a first time conviction for this felony carried a sentence of 5 to 30 years and a second conviction 10 to 40. Furthermore, Georgia was a two strike state, meaning that the second conviction for certain crimes would automatically result in life in prison without the possibility of parole. Damn. Um, Furthermore, yes, yeah, I just had to take that in. All right, that's crazy. All right, so under the state's penal code, a first-time conviction for this period is yes, and the two strike meaning the second conviction for certain crimes would automatically result in life in prison without the possibility of parole. While drug dealing was not one of those two strike crimes, there were recidivist statutes that could be combined with the drug felonies, which, when appended to his previous conviction, could still bring down a sentence of life in prison for Big E, who was 21 years old. Before the end of the day on which those arrests were made, however, a new suspect was being targeted by police as the killer of Daryl Woods. And by nightfall, Big E had become the state's star witness, an eyewitness even, against that new suspect, Michael Lewis. He would be able to bolster his statement with the testimony of two of his lieutenants who were then in jail on their own drug charges, and with that of a woman in pink fluffy slippers who often sat in a folding chair out on Griffin Street. Everybody in New Jack, including the police, would come to endorse Big E's version of the events of that night, or a variation of it. Everybody would corroborate the motive Big E would provide, or some variation, a motive that would become a mob mantra within days. Even Valerie Johnson, riding in the police car, would later support this accusation. Moreover, she would try, on the way to Fulton County Youth Detention Center, to persuade her son, as she herself had perhaps been persuaded to confess. Howard had a stunning case, one that would serve as an opening salvo to announce his new position and his intentions to fulfill his campaign promise. If that case rested solely on the testimony of a man facing a life sentence in prison, well, so be it. Little B was a black street tough who had killed Woods, a working black man, a husband, and a father to prove his toughness, his manhood. Little B was the perfect perpetrator in the eyes of all concerned. A warrant had been issued for his arrest for the murder of Daryl Woods, who had himself been known on the street as Little D. All of Michael Lewis's short life, they had come for him. From the time his home had become a crack house when he was in third grade, they had come. They had come to arrest. They had come to arrest Val for prostitution or drugs, or to arrest her other son, J Boy, for drugs or whatever. They had come three times to take little B to court for deprivation hearings on the fitness of his mother. Once they had to come once they had come to arrest him for shoplifting, and once when he was 10 for a schoolyard fight that was recorded as a battery. Wow, that's crazy. Hmm, I can see it. I mean, this is common. I mean, it happens a lot, more often than people realize. Um, three other times they had come to get him as a quote unquote runaway, once as quote unquote ungovernable, and once for quote unquote disorderly conduct. I hate that term. It can mean it's so broad, but never for truancy, though he had not been in school for 2 weeks by this time. He was a throwaway boy, never worth very much, except maybe now as a perfect scapegoat for the ambitious and expediencies of Eric Mills, the Atlanta police, Paul Howard, Bill Campbell, and a number of Fortune 500 companies. When they came this time, he had no idea what it was about. Surely the black and white detectives who came to arrest Michael that late afternoon were as overwhelmed as I would later be by the putrid smell emaciating from the open sewer line that ran along the front of the filthy apartment complex. Well, this was where Michael's quote unquote stayed, they had been told, presumably by Big E and J Boy. Having been on the streets since he was 11 without the benefit of housing or any other basic support from DFACS or the juvenile court or the school system or any community church or other institution. Little B, quote unquote, stayed here or there. Recently had been there at J Boy's place on Holly Street. So that's where he was when the police came and knocked on the front door with its peeling red paint. Val appeared, ready to ride with him in one of the police cars outside. Who is it? They would testify. He answered the door from the other side of the red door. Police, they politely responded, or so they would say. He thought they were there about his brother or his mother, as usual. He had come back to the apartment not long before after spending most of his days at the malls with his brother's baby mama. Shalance battle. Noticing that Morgan's handgun had been left lying out in the open, he protectively tossed it out of sight of the doorway into a couch. He then opened the door. He did not run. He did not resist. That they had in fact come for him, that it was he who was under arrest. Still seemed still seemed a normal part of life in his universe until the detectives completed the sentence by saying, "For the murder of Daryl Woods." He had never heard of Daryl Woods. He had never even killed anyone. His heart was beating fast, he would later say. Within hours, Valerie Johnson would tell the police that her son had confessed to her. Within days, she would tell them that he had admitted knowing where the murder weapon was hidden in the back of the complex where J Boy lived, where the police had arrested him. Returning to retrieve the gun, a rifle, the police would find it in the exact spot Michael's mother had described. Even though by then more than a week had passed since the murder, Howard could rest his case. When Michael's arrest was announced, the city cheered. Everybody knew it had been someone like Little B. When Paul Howard declared his intention to try Little B as an adult, as per the provisions of the new law, the city cheered again. The mayor spoke of rooting out evil and proclaimed in a press conference a few days after the arrest, "We believe the person responsible has been found." The blacks of New Birth Missionary Baptists and the like those in the bureaucratic pyramid, sighed with relief at being absolved of shame. This was the face of evil in the black community and in the city. The businessmen were satisfied. Even in the cast a spell beauty shop that day, there was a fiery rage over the cage, a fiery rage over the case, a rage that seemed to me, as I sat under the dryer, hotter than the straining comb pressing the black woman's hair. All the patrons were shouting to one another, none appearing to see what was on the street outside, out by Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard, where deferred dreams strolled by in the silence created by the shop's giant front windows. There were the regulars, as it were, including the man with the mangled hair who scratched his crotch through the gaping hole in the pants he wore, and seemingly must have worn all his life, pacing up and down the street. There were numberless others strutting by in the parade, the toothless, drug addicted, worn women, the unemployed young blacks bouncing by to their music, the shuffling old people invariably carrying an abundance of used shopping bags, the nondescript community consumers trying to find a bargain at the dollar store, or some long and shiny synthetic hair at a beauty supply place, or a filling meal at the McDonald's next door, or the subway across the street. I am so sick of these little niggers that mess up our communities, one woman said as the razor cleaned up her kitchen, the rough edges of hair at the nape of her neck. If the boy did the crime, he got to do the time. Yeah, killed a brother, a good brother. He wanted to act like a man. Now let's see what it's like to be treated like a man. Another said, reading from the latest story in the Atlanta Journal Constitution to verify and validate her position. The dryer's heat on my head mercifully allowed me to fall unnoticed into a stupor of sorrow. Wow. Chapter 3, Evil in the City. Say, he said, that day, the spirit of Nat King Cole's enchanted nature boy. You think I'm really evil? Was it really a question? I wondered in silence. Hearing me, somehow, he answered. I mean, a lot of people say that about me. This was, of course, after the conviction. The jury had only taken a few hours to reach its verdict. It was the first week of his life sentence. His life had been spared because he was just 14 years old, only a boy, and the state could not impose the death penalty. He had already been transferred to the Lee Arundel State Prison, a maximum security facility in the little town of Alto, tucked deep in the beautiful North Georgia mountains north of Gainesville, a one time harbor for the Ku Klux Klan. I heard about this is Forsyth County, I think. Uh, this mountainous region was still home to a rural population of majority white, mostly poor people. The prison, um, I'm reading the New Age Racism, the Condemnation of Little B, because I'm bored and need some hours. Um, he's got his own channel on here, Little B from the Bluff. He was 14 years old when he was sent to prison for murder, and he was just released. I think he's probably about 40 something now. Yeah. Um, this was, of course, after the conviction. The jury had only taken a few hours. The first week of his sentence, he had been spared. Yes, and now he's in Alto, blah, blah, blah. It was hard to reckon with the beauty residing there, as it was so much real evil resting in the mountain's memory and in the steel and concrete of Lee Arundel State Prison. This boy, Michael Lewis, had seriously questioned, there in the stillness of his prison, surrounded by the serenity of those hills, whether he was evil. Atlanta's mayor, Bill Campbell, had broadcast the same theme, almost as a clarion call. It was nearly a year before immediately following the arrest of this boy, whose name was now indelibly written in the historical records as Little B. Little B was an evil in the city the mayor had proclaimed. His words had echoed from City Hall to the editorial pages of the Atlanta Journal Constitution and had been carried through the streets of Atlanta and out to the suburbs. Lily white enclaves. Little B was evil. The very utterance seemed to me an expression of some sort of primal fear of the beast within. It was though it was as though Little B were a mythical wolf boy. It was as though some dark spirit hovering in an world had placed an imprint upon his being, or some sort of satanic genetic code had been embedded in his skin and soul, all unexorcisable. When I caught my breath, I answered him, saying simply, "No." Then I added, "If there is evil here, Michael, it's not you." Since Michael had not killed this man, he seemed to have no other explanation for how his life had gone from bad to worse. It was surely difficult to comprehend being plunged from his already Dixonian existence into the abyss of life in prison after only 14 years of living. It must have been easy to believe this was a matter beyond the world of men and their political expediencies, some sort of nightmare. Thus, the word evil had come to him, issuing from the mayor's mouth through the press to the courtroom and jury, and now eating away at him within his new prison. Something was evil, even he had begun to think it was inside of him. The stereotyping of black kids, especially boys, as menaces to society was enjoying a revival in American life at the time of Michael's trial. Subliminal messages hinting at some deviant quality inherent to black boys were flooding the nation's editorial pages, and headlines like "racist Rorschach test," uh, Rorschach test. Among the proliferation of the Journal Constitution editorials written about Michael was once published only a week after his arrest, which was developed this logic conclusion supported by nothing more than its two-sided cases that Michael was the latest exemplar of a new breed of scary kids. These were young killers living outside the bounds of normal social interaction, tiny thugs who would kill at the slightest insult, or sometimes without any provocation, and added an emphasis to that. That in the myriad of similar pieces that followed, the newspaper painted a dark portrait of Michael as an evil in our town, a teen thug, a predator, possessed of an irresistible urge to walk on the dark side, seduced, like other boys in Black America, by the allure of ghetto streets of unspeakable savagery. The Reagan and Bush years had tempted Americans with the heady proposition that the country's ills were confined to street crime, and that the intoxicating solution to the problem was simply to quote unquote get tough on crime. As the country's white majority moved further to the right with Reagan and Bush, the definition of crime became more specifically urban and black. It was a thing rooted in the ghetto and the exclusive province of its occupants, as evidenced by the alleged inundation of the country by crimes perpetuated by young blacks perpetrated by young black street toughs. Ironically, of course, the early Reagan years had also shepherded a boundless supply of crack cocaine into the empty markets of the country's black communities, setting off the infamous ghetto drug wars that would ravage them over the next decade. Public careers now turned on the question of toughness of crime, which itself became a kind of drug to which politicians, police, and established social commentators became codependently addicted, with the problem and the solution thus identified. The addiction fed upon itself and invented a new dark mythology, tying black youth to what was deemed to be, by the time Bill Clinton took office in 1993, a juvenile crime wave, or more particularly in the code of the day, an urban juvenile crime wave. The nation's most prestigious and widely respected and read journals were harbingers of these bad tidings, whipping up what had become a public frenzy. In August of 1998, the New York Times seemed to surge ahead of the pack with its coverage of the arrest of two black boys from Chicago for the rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl. In a sensational front page story, the Times transformed this Chicago crime report into an issue of national significance. The story was founded solely upon the local police department's theory and reports about the murder and the accused perpetrators, who were 7 and 8 years old. The police theory, the Times reported, held that these young boys had raped and killed in connection with their theft of her blue bicycle, as the headline poignantly lamented. The story was accompanied by a large, sweet color photograph of the deceased child, her innocent brown face subliminally cueing to the reader to infer the color of the boys charged with her death, whose faces could not be shown. It was hard to summon a memory of any other time the Times might have allocated one page space to a color photograph of a black child. The point of the story was captured in a subhead that identified the boys as perhaps the youngest Americans ever charged with murder, and in a quote from Chicago's mayor, the son and namesake of the city's infamous political boss, Richard Daley. The ages of these offenders, very frightening. The writer, Pam Bullock, established a presumption of guilt by providing an elaborately detailed description of the bestial acts of the boys were accused of having committed. The victim, Ryan Harris, and the older boy, anonymous but for the fact that he was black and 8 years old, had been seen riding their bicycles together on the morning of the day of the murder, according to police. At some point, they had encountered the 7-year-old boy, who likewise remained unidentified. Suddenly, the article reported that the 7-year-old had begun to throw rocks at Ryan, one of which struck her in the head. According to detectives, the boys then dragged the unconscious girl to a wooded area, pulled down her underpants, stuffed them into her mouth, and molested her. And yes, there was apparently no question of the boys' culpability. Bullock's piece noted for the police had obtained confessions from both of them. With the question of guilt thus resolved, Bullock, though additional police quotes, attempted to trace the roots of the boys' monstrous acts. Ryan, she explained, ordinarily lived in a working class Chicago suburb, but she had been spending the summer with relatives in the impoverished section of the city where she was murdered. The boys, in contrast, were native products of that ghetto's streets. No doubt, in an effort to balance the story, Bullock included a few brief statements by neighbors who refused to believe that these boys could have really committed such a heinous crime. These articles' dominant theme, though, washed over such comments, and that the theme prevailed. The story ended with a summary of the national debate over appropriate arrest procedures for young criminals. And for its part, the Atlanta Journal Constitution followed up reports of the Chicago story with a full editorial page bearing the title Conversation Starter, in which the editors invited public response. The question posed was, how should courts handle the unthinkable? The unthinkable being the fact that very young, presumably black boys, were now roaming the streets and killing people. joining the Times in its complete disregard for the presumption of innocence or journalistic ethics. Editorial board classified any confusion the readers might have had as to the nature and meaning of the question being raised. In a country growing more accustomed to baby-faced murderers, this horrible Chicago case still shocks. Similar stories about two boys consumed other newspaper columns, radio talk shows, and nightly television broadcasts across the nation in mid 1998. In early September, however, the charges against them were quietly dropped. A more likely perpetrator, a grown man who was by then in jail on other charges, had been identified. Floyd Durr, 30 years old, would soon admit to the of raping little Ryan and would be later charged for the murder. The sound of silence that subsequently fell over the nation on the subject of these boys amounted to a thud. It was impossible to find even a whispered recantation in the media of the hysterical, wholesale condemnation of the pair. No newspaper editorial page invited public response to the reckless, racist presumption of guilt that had been trumpeted in such bold headlines and so many column inches only weeks before. Even in the face of the real rapist's admission, there was no editorial examination of the facts of the case or the revisitation of how it was that so many could easily have concluded that these young boys, these very young black boys, were responsible for, let alone physically capable of producing the semen found on the poor girl's body. At a point, their ghetto neighbor had tried to raise in the few sentences they were afforded in the established press. There were, if anything, mere blurbs in the nation's newspapers about the charges having been dropped against the boys. In the main, there was only the proverbial deafening silence, particularly on the preposition advanced by this Chicago story that America was being overrun by black boy predators who stood poised in the nation's innocence. It was not until February of 1999 that a lone voice broke in silence. It was that of liberal writer Alex Kotlowitz, who published a massive confessional piece in the New York Magazine. Therein, he attempted to explain why America, including himself, or white America, including himself, had been so willing had been so willing to summarily similarly damn those two black boys. It would be some months before, as Time magazine would report in a piece on its crime page, Cook County prosecutors dur- Cook County prosecutors charged Durr, a convicted sex offender already with the murder of Ryan Harris. Durr, who had previously confessed to the child's rape, was now positively linked to her murder through DNA. The boys were thus completely exonerated, while bemoaning the trauma they had suffered by being so wrongfully accused. Time reporter Ron Stokehill II also included in his coverage a kind of sidebar portrait of the family of one of the boys, which seemed to offer an explanation for the confusion. He wrote, Roshetta Crawford, the boy's grandmother and family matriarch, took a drag on her cigarette and said softly, somehow we became the most hated people in the world. These Chicago boys were not the first youngsters on the receiving end of the country's visible renewal of the wholesale condemnation of black youth that had marketed its pre-civil rights history. In 1997, for example, in Oakland County, Michigan, Nathaniel Jamal Abraham was charged with first-degree murder. In an AP Wire service story, Nathaniel was referred to suggestively by County Assistant Prosecutor Lisa Tomko as quote unquote no ordinary 11-year-old boy. For his part, Police Captain Greg Formanzek professed to feel shock and disbelief that someone that small and young could be a suspect in that type of crime. According to police, it was a random shooting, a claim that veiled the case in the increasingly popular imagery of the black boy as a predator, out searching for something to kill, choosing its prey randomly. Even a trivial incident could bring down serious consequences on a black boy. In West Palm Beach, Florida, in 1998, a 15-year-old Anthony Lancaster was charged with strong arm robbery on the strength of an accusation that he had snatched $2 from the pocket of a classmate. Arrested, charged, and held over trial as an adult, he remained in jail for weeks until the absurdity of the case attracted the attention of the popular 60 Minutes television program. At that point, and especially after it was made public that the alleged victim had conceded that Anthony had not so much intimidated him as made him quote unquote mad, prosecutors were obliged to drop the case. More seriously, in 1996, Sharif Cousin was sentenced to death in Louisiana when he was only 16, making him one of the youngest people in America on death row. Condemned, awaiting execution in the infamous Louisiana State Prison at Angola, one of the star deputies under New Orleans prosecutor Harry Connick Sr., oh, it must be the father, was able to get a conviction in the case without producing any physical evidence. He convinced the jury that Sharif was guilty based solely on tentative eyewitness testimony, primarily that the victim's girlfriend, who said she remembered Sharif's gaze, an assertion later called into question by her admission that on the night of the murder robbery, she had not been wearing the contact lenses she needed in order to see. All too typically, the man Sharif was accused of killing and had the man Sharif was accused of killing had been white. According to a report published by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, fully two-thirds of the 72 juveniles on death row in America in 1999 were children of color, predominantly black, while two-thirds of the victims in these capital cases had been white. Between 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated in the United States, and 1996, 318 defendants were tried, convicted, and executed for the deaths of 426 victims. Nearly 40% of those victims were black and 55% white, yet only a little over 1% of the whites executed had been convicted of killing black victims, while despite the presumed increase in black on black crime, twice as many blacks were executed for killing white victims as were put to death for killing other blacks. What was even more compelling about this particular case, though, according to Sharif's appellate attorney, Clive Stafford, Price, Clive Stafford Smith of the Crisis Assistance Center team in New Orleans, was that the boys' basketball coach swore he had been playing a game at the time of the murder robbery. Moreover, a videotape of that game confirmed the time and showed Sharif playing. Still, it was not until 1999 that this incontrovertible, incontrovertible evidence finally persuaded an appellate court to overturn Sharif's conviction. He was set free after spending half his teen years at Angola facing execution for a crime he had not committed. Although it's primarily black boys who have come to exemplify such evil, black girls have not been exempt. There was, for instance, the 1996 case of Lucretia Murray, who at 11 was charged with murder in Austin, Texas. Accused of killing a baby, Lucretia, like the two boys in Chicago, made a quote unquote false accusation after being subjected to intense, isolated police grilling, and in her case, over a period of 4 days, in fact, she was innocent and lucky enough to have supporters who fought to get her case reopened and the conviction overturned. Through the process, although the process took over 3 years, others have been much less fortunate. For example, 14-year-old Anisha Walker, who was convicted in Arlington County, Texas, for the 1997 shooting death of a 41-year-old man. The Dallas Morning News quoted Arlington Police Detective John Stanton as suggesting that Anisha did not have the appearance attitude of a young girl. This seems to provide the prosecutor with the justification to make her the youngest person in the country ever tried as an adult. The first tried under the new state law that passed in 1995, authorizing prosecutors to try children as young as 14 as adults. The law, authored by Arlington's Republican State Representative Toby Goodman and vigorously supported by then Governor George W. Bush, reflected the dominant social attitude in the country and the state. That Anisha was the first in the home district of the bill's author to be prosecuted under the law, also reflected its intent, which was to get girls like her, from whom Goodman asserted the public had a right to be safe, off the streets. Um, Brian Buchanan, Anisha's defense attorney, shed a different light on the matter. In a telephone interview, he stated that his client, who had been forced into prostitution at an even younger age by older men, had been hired off the street by the Nigerian immigrant she was charged with killing. Instead of paying her, he had held her prisoner in his apartment for days, repeatedly raping her and beating her. Finally, she had found the will and a way to shoot the man and escape. Buchanan concluded that it was because she was so tragically poor and black that seemingly nobody in the country could imagine that Anisha deserved to exercise the right of self defense and therefore to be adjudged innocent. The case that set the precedent for all the others in this new trend of indicting and punishing black children as super predators was that of 11-year-old Robert Yummy Sandifer. In 1994, Yummy's face provided Time magazine with its own cover image for a story that purported birth of a new breed of young urban killers. Yummy was exploited too by the recently elected president Bill Clinton to exemplify what he claimed was a growing problem in the United States, which had led him to declare in his September 10, 1994 radio address at National Gang Violence Prevention Week. More significantly, Yummy was used by Bill Clinton to garner and bolster Republican support for his 1994 crime bill, which toughened the nation's laws relating to juvenile crime offenders and introduced innovative, innovative procedures for punishing them, including the creation of boot camps and drug courts. Yummy was the reason, according to Clinton, that America had to become tough on crime. But perhaps the most interesting thing about Yummy's case and the infamy being heaped upon him in the press was this. Not only had he never been charged with, tried for, or convicted of the murder of which he stood publicly accused, but also, and even more curiously, he was deceased within days of allegedly having killed a 14-year-old girl. Yummy had killed himself. Nevertheless, Time magazine devoted its cover story to unsubstantiated reports that Yummy had murdered this other black child. The Time theory was that he had been fulfilling a gang initiation requirement to kill, but had missed his intended target and accidentally shot and killed Siobhan instead. In the days after the incident, street rumors had reportedly spread that Yummy was planning to turn himself into police. Before such a scenario could play out, however, he was found under a bridge, shot to death, presumably by other gang members, eager to keep him from talking. Yummy's tragic death, which paralleled the tragedy of his short life, he had been homeless and abandoned by the time he was 8, did not keep him from being held up for public denunciation as a ruthless killer. The Time reporters apparently scoured the blighted Roseland community. I know what that is. I know where that is, Roseland. It's in a community college. Oh no, community of Chicago South Side. to talk with Yummy's neighbors, unearthing an anonymous source who offered the opinion that the boy had been a sociopath. Time writer Julie Grace provided a description of the sociopathic Yummy, a 4 foot 8 feet, 68-pound runt, pedaling through the streets on his seatless black bike in high priced tennis shoes and big baggy clothes, with a nappy hairstyle, intimidating neighbors with his use of knives, fire, and guns. He would still steal, sell drugs, and set fires. Finally, the manager of a local corner store voiced sentiments about Yummy that seemed to echo those of the nation. They should have hung him in the middle of the street. It was no surprise that Time had stepped into the vanguard of a new national discussion about the country's black problem. In its cover about in its cover story about Yummy, the powerful weekly cultivated a new idiom for white racism which had been muted by the politically correct language and behavior promoted in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s by the last gasp of liberals. Now, with the Times report on the rise of a new breed of criminals in America, the young black super predator, racist stereotyping, and the integration of blacks could regain their power in the social discourse and landscape. Times founder Henry Luce had established this journalistic tradition. According to his biography, Luce had not hesitated to use his magazine to deflect the principles in which he believed. As a Republican, defender of big business, uh, a foe of big labor, it was Luce, after all, who had been the architect of the notion that the 20th century was the American century, in which America, that is, the white right wing America defined by Luce, would claim its manifest destiny to lead and dominate the world. The promulgation of the stereotype of the black boy as a social evil is at once a product of the press and a deflection of a deeper social reality. This does not, however, diminish the powerful role of the media in providing American racism with a vocabulary and a definition in the post-civil rights movement era. The Western press is known as the Fourth Estate, the fourth arm of the ruling social class. Like American common law, the power of the press derives historically from English and French social structure. The process began in the 14th century when Western monarchs, seeking to abate imminent popular threats to their absolute power, ordained the clergy first as an estate or arm of themselves, securing their rule by divine right. Next came the nomination of the nobility as a second estate, a new partner in power. The end of the 18th century and the opening of the New Worlds brought the desperate establishment of a third auxiliary, an entity alleged to represent the common people. It was the Third Estate that dominated the leadership of the French and American Revolution. The Fourth Estate, the press, was the last branch of the ruling power structure. While the pre industrial monarchies of the West have withered into relative irrelevancy, there remains unquestionably an elite class of people that rule America. Its voice in the American press, its primary mission is to articulate and defend the interests of big corporations and important individuals whose advertising dollars, after all, support newspaper and magazine distribution and television and radio programming. The press in America, as an extension of the powerful, has come to define the day. Even as Michael Lewis was being held up by the local press as an evil presence in society and offered up to the prosecutor and to the politicians as a singular sacrifice for their common agenda regarding juvenile crime, a teen time bomb was exploding in America's heartland. Nice white boys, true sons of America, children of the Bible Belt and suburbia, were committing multiple mass murders so bold and so brutal that they could neither be concealed nor whitewashed. The dominant voices in America, the press and the politicians, seemed stunned by these murders, though not necessarily outraged. This time the question was, what's happening to our children? On October 1st, 1997, a month or so before Michael was to stand trial, a 16-year-old Luke Woodham of Pearl, Mississippi, stabbed his 50-year-old mother to death in her bed. He then went to school, Pearl High, where he fatally shot two fellow students and wounded seven others. Woodham admitted to these heinous acts, but pled not guilty by reason of being possessed. He was tried as an adult, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison in June of 1998. Notwithstanding this, or the paralyzing effects on national life of the rash of mass murders perpetrated by other white boys in the period between Woodham's murder and his sentencing, the press portrayed him, upon his conviction, not only as an evil boy, but rather as the innocent victim of an evil demonic cult. In particular, it was an Associated Press wire story about Woodham circulating through most of the nation's newspapers during his trial that promulgated this theory, identifying him in fairly conservative language as a teenager accused of fatally stabbing his mother and gunning down two classmates. The wire service report focused on psychological analysis of Woodham provided by defense experts related to his possession. Through this story and its spin offs, Woodham obtained the status of a psychologically disturbed young man. Indeed, he was deemed vulnerable to being exploited by certain older boys who, according to police reports, led a cult like group of teenagers. The end result of this vulnerability to demonic influence was the AP story explained that Woodham woke up that morning and saw demons. And evidently, this is how he came to be surprised when moments later he opened his eyes to find his mother lying in her bed, not only fatally stabbed, but also bludgeoned with a baseball bat. And the AP photograph of Woodham picked up by the Atlanta Journal on the day of his first conviction for the murder of his mother bore as its captions a quote from him: "Everything happens for a reason, it's God's will." Woodham's case was the first case in a series of like multiple murders that would grip the nation over the next few years. All of the perpetrators, all of them, the boys would be defined in the press as possessed, evil, misunderstood, alienated, lonely, icy, but never evil. Just months after Woodham murdered his mother and two classmates, 14-year-old Michael Carneal, son of locally prominent lawyer and elder in the Lutheran Church of West Paducah, Kentucky, fired into a Christian prayer circle of his fellow students at Heath High School, killing three of them. Mm. Carneal's murderous rampage, in which five others were also wounded, was described in the press as a mystery, perhaps even to the boy himself. Some wondered whether they would ever have an answer. The town sheriff noted he said he was sorry, while one minister was quoted saying, "I believe there is a real demonic force that would drive someone to do this." The Reverend Paul Donner of the St. Paul Lutheran Church insisted, "I'm firmly convinced Michael Carneal is a Christian." Only months after that, on March 24th, 1998, 13-year-old Mitchell Johnson and 11-year-old Andrew Golden, armed with four handguns and three high-powered rifles and outfitted in camouflage gear, ambushed fellow students at Westside Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and opened fire on them. They killed the four girls and one teacher and wounded 11 other children. These killings became the cover story of every major journal in the country and the subject of unending electronic media reports. Newsweek magazine sublimated its coverage of the 13th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in order to devote nearly an entire issue to the Jonesboro incident. The resulting story was a variation on the New American theme, "What Makes Kids Kill?" The Newsweek piece concluded that the only confusion reigned in such cases because, in the words of one of Johnson's teachers, For the most part, kids like Johnson are sheltered and innocent, and the writer reported that on being apprehended, Johnson kept saying he was sorry, while Golden was said to act, and he was sobbing in a cell, and everyone said the same thing in Jonesboro. Now the relatives of the suspects and the victims, townspeople and teachers, they're sorry that it happened, and it was so very, very senseless. Although Johnson was the same age as Little B at the time of their arrest, he was tried as a juvenile with the younger Golden. After pleading guilty, both were sentenced to confinement in juvenile facilities until the age of 18, at which point they will, each of them, be released. For Johnson, this will mean 5 years of incarceration. A year later, in May of 1999, in the wake of the notorious similar tragedy in Littleton, Colorado, Newsweek published an opinion piece by Johnson's father, Scott, about his son's incarceration. A friendly color photograph of the author accompanied the essay, in which the senior Johnson, speaking as a kind of self appointed spokesman for the parents of white boy killers, expressed his profound puzzlement about what had gone wrong and how could it have happened to his child. He pleaded with America to understand these desperate kids in need of attention, though he stressed that in the end, his greatest concern for Mitchell's future, he worried, he wrote, about what kind of person his son, who had ambushed and murdered 5 people and wounded 11 others, would be upon his eventual release, having been housed in a facility full of young gangbangers. Yeah, he was probably like, you can't come over here. The growing rate of cadre and confused parents only months after came to con- came to include only a month after the Jonesboro killing, those of 14-year-old Andrew Worst. Worst, carrying his father's 25 caliber handgun, went to the 8th grade graduation in Edinburgh, Pennsylvania, and opened fire on celebrants, killing a teacher, wounding 2 students, another in an AP wire story while quoting friends of the boys as saying that he had in the past, quote unquote, joked about killing people. Noted that Worst apparently didn't say he had planned to kill at the dance. As to answers, then the story quoted friends of Worst who described him as having a troubled home and combative parents. Finally, the superintendent of the school district, seeming to speak for one and all, said, "The sad part of this whole thing is I don't have any answers. I don't either because I'm taking a break." I didn't finish chapter 3, but yeah,